Good morning and welcome, everyone. You must be getting ready to wrap up and head home on day three of this exciting conference. Thank you in advance for your attention. I'll keep my presentation brisk and we'll take questions after that if the internet gods allow. Are your eyes on the screen? Because we are about to look at something really interesting. India has the fastest growing construction industry in the world. On the screen now, you should be seeing the projected built up area in India. Can you believe the slope from 2010 to 2070? In the next 25 years, India will more than double the total area of its buildings compared to where we are today. And in 45 years, by 2070, the built up area will be more than 4 times the current footprint. Today, we are at about 21 billion square meters. By 2050, we are expected to be at 54 billion square meters. By 2070, we are expected to be at or above 94 billion square meters. So everything above this blue T square that I've used here to draw the line is yet to be built. Imagine the potential for impact that architects have in this scenario. We will look at this data in some more depth shortly. For now, let's note that India is the fourth largest construction market in the world after the countries of US, China, and Japan. It is growing at 7 to 8% every year and expected to overtake Japan in the next couple of years and become the third largest construction market globally. It is expected to reach a market size of 1.4 trillion US dollars. This figure is according to recent research conducted in 2022 by a company called Sikagen, a Singaporean infrastructure company. You see, other countries are studying India for its potential construction market size. My focus is on how we can achieve this strikingly large growth in a sustainable way in the face of climate change that ensures a habitable environment for us and for our future generations. I will take a couple of minutes to explain where I'm coming from. As mentioned in the introduction, my name is Smita Chandra Thomas. You know how some people are recovering alcoholics? I am a recovering architect. In fact, Anveshan is being held in the city where I went to college. I did my architecture from the College of Engineering, Trivandrum, and Trivandrum is also the home of my in-laws. That's where the Thomas in my name comes from. And I still visit Trivandrum with my family. I really wish I could have joined you all in person. I hope you're enjoying some good weather there at this time of the year. So much cooler than northern India at this time of the year. But Kerala gets really hot in December. You know, Kerala was not so hot and humid in the 1980s when we went to college. And the dry heat of Delhi was not so hot and so dry when I went to high school there for 2 years. And then in Himachal, where I grew up until my teenage years, we never needed more than a fan in the summer in my hometown of Sundarnagar, which is on the way to Kullu Manali in Mandi district. There was only one way to get to our town in the 70s and 80s. We had to drive on a single lane road for 5 hours through the hills. There was the beautiful smell of pine trees as we entered the hills. And now we have a 4 lane highway lined with construction all the way from Chandigarh to Kullu Manali. No pine trees. You can cover the entire distance all the way to Kullu in about 4 hours. My hometown of Sundarnagar has become unbearable in the summer without an air conditioner. And now we have floods in Kullu, the Valley of Gods in the north, and more floods in Wayanad, in God's own country of Kerala in the south. I have beautiful memories of holidays spent in both places. My fellow architects, our construction activity has brought us to this point, and we can design our way out of this. Buildings can be part of the climate solution and a financially sound part of the climate solution. Through the naturally beautiful environment in which I spent my formative years, to my education in building science from UCLA and Berkeley, and then through my work in energy efficiency and climate science since the 90s, I've been acutely tuned to the difference we can make through buildings. With a math and science approach to problems, which most of us architects have that background in math and science, I tend to look at quantifying this difference in a measurable way. And that is how I'll be discussing sustainability in design with you today. How can we design in a measurably more sustainable way? There are three main parts to my talk: framing the future of buildings in India, estimating the climate impact of that future, and then considering the guardrails that we architects can use to design our buildings for a habitable future. Please hold your questions for the discussion after part 3, and please note the slide number on which you have a question so that we can jump back to it easily. What do we know about the projections for building construction in India? Let's revisit the area that India is expected to build in the next few years. All data points to the projection that India will more than double its area by 2050. We are here and we'll be here, and quadruple it by 2070 compared to 2018 levels. We saw this chart earlier at a high level. We can see more data on this one. Data is king. To make good decisions, we must look at good, verified data. The data for 2010 and 2018 in dark blue, right here, is actual built-up area in India as surveyed by Pike Research. The brighter blue numbers further up the slope are projections. You may have heard people say that most buildings that will exist in India in 2050 are yet to be built. You can see that here. This means that in the next 25 years, we will more than double the current built-up area of India. Let's look at the numbers. Our team looked at various reputable sources for this data, which are listed in the table. So India had 7 billion square meters of built-up area in 2010. In the next 8 years, India more than doubled it, adding another 10 billion square meters. India is projected to build another 7 billion square meters by 2028, and this puts us at about 21 billion square meters today by inference, which is 3 times where we were in 2010. In only 14 years, we have increased our built-up area by 3 times. India is projected to be at 32 billion square meters by 2038, which is nearly 5 times the 2010 level. And then the projections for 2050 are 54 billion by one estimate and closer to 68 billion square meters in another estimate. India is projected to reach somewhere between 95 billion to 105 billion square meters of built-up area by 2070. That is only in the next 45 years. This is why the global consulting firm McKinsey says in a 2022 report that over 3/4 of the India of 2050 and 80+% of the India of 2070 are yet to be built. All that new construction is ripe for innovation. Note that this chart also splits the built-up area into commercial area in blue versus the residential area in orange. Quite consistently through the decades, you will see that the residential area in India is about 90% of the total. And this trend is expected to continue. That gives you some idea of the sector with the most opportunities. Also note that the slope was steeper from 2010 to 2018 and has slowed down a bit between 2018 and 2038. But the projected slope from 2038 to 2070 is again quite steep. Why are all these studies projecting this enormous growth? There is a trifecta of forces driving India's construction growth. One, a growing economy. Two, a growing population. And three, increasing percentages of that growing population migrating from rural to urban areas, attracted by the economic opportunities. Let's look briefly at each. What is happening with India's economy? To look forward effectively, we must look back. Look at the economic trajectory India is on. The World Bank data on India's GDP going back to 1960 shows that India's economy grew about 10 times in the 34 years between 1960 and 1994, and another 10 times in the 28 years between 1994 and 2022. That is, it has been growing roughly 10 times every 30 years or 3 decades. Since the early 1980s, India's annual GDP growth rate, that is your gross domestic product growth rate, has hovered between 4 to 8% for the most part. Based on these historic averages, India's economy is set to double every 10 to 12 years, which translates to roughly another 10 times growth again in the next 30 years. So if the GDP was 3 trillion US dollars in 2020, we can expect a GDP of about 30 trillion US dollars around 2050, 30 years. This increasing wealth is creating a rapidly growing middle class. Now, the population has grown at the same rate, fortunately. India doubled its population in the 32 years between 1965 and 1997. And the population has only grown another 50% in the 25 years since then. That means that the GDP per capita has been growing tremendously. GDP is growing 10x and population is growing only 2x to 1.5x. So this again equates to a growing middle class with much increased purchasing power per capita. This increase in individual wealth is driving the demand for construction, especially for housing, at a mass scale. Finally, let's look at urban population. Again, World Bank data shows that 80 million people lived in cities in India in 1960. In 1970, just 10 years later, when the first national building codes were published, and please note that I'm highlighting some of these years because they're related to construction. So in 1970, India's urban population was 110 million. From 80, we went to 110. By 1994, it was 250 million people, about a quarter of the total population living in cities. In 2007, when the first national building energy codes were published, the urban population was now more than 350 million. That happens to be the total population of the US. In fact, it's more than the total population of the US. And more recently, in 2022, it was more than 500 million. In the table, you can see the percentages, and they show the steady trend of population moving towards cities. So here's the urban population, here's the total population, and here's the percentage. Again, data is king. In 2022, nearly 1/3 of the population of India was living in cities. By 2050, more than half the population in India is expected to be urban. What was 80 million in 2010 is going to be more than 10 times at 814 million by 2050, over just 40 years. So the largest opportunity is in the housing sector in the cities in India. Now, the global population is projected to be 9.8 billion. Let's say 10 billion in 2050. Okay, out of which India's population may be around 1.5 billion. The UN estimates that India's population will likely peak at 1.7 billion in the 2060s, but it could also peak at 1.5 billion by the 2040s in a different scenario. Either way, India will be the most populous country in the world by far in 2050 and through 2070. One in every six people in the world will live in India by 2050. That is our 1.5 billion people. And of these 1.5 billion people, more than 50% will live in an Indian city. That's our 814 million. That means a twelfth of the world's population will live in a city in India. About one in every six people in the world will be an Indian, and half of those, one in every 12 in the world, will be living in an Indian city in 2050. Keep in mind that these numbers are all projections based on what we know from history. Very smart people spend their entire lives analyzing these trends. But all these numbers might go out the window if there's a new pandemic, or a world war could change the economic and population trajectory. Political or social instability can easily tank the economy, changing the construction trend, or all of human civilization might fall to artificial intelligence. As they say, the only thing certain about the future is uncertainty. But still, we must study these likely scenarios and prepare to control what we can. So, coming to the second part of my presentation, if things stay more or less on the current track, what can we expect as climate impacts? Annual average temperatures are rising in India. I'm sure you can all feel it. The chart shows projections of temperature changes in India between 1960 and 2100 in a few different scenarios. In the best case scenario, the average annual temperatures will increase by about 1 degree Celsius in 2040. In the worst case scenario, average temperatures are projected to go up by 6 degrees Celsius. Given the uncertainty, I would say let's get prepared for the worst and let's see what we can do to help keep those lines stay down. Besides the average temperature increase, urban areas in particular are hotter by 12 to 17 degrees compared to surrounding rural areas. This has been found in a study by the European Commission's Joint Research Center. In fact, the city of Medellin in Mexico has reduced its average temperature by 2 degrees by planting green corridors of trees in the city. In the absence of such measures in India, the projections by IIA in the graphic here show that urban households will see the biggest increase in air conditioners. So this is the number of households in millions. Gray is rural, blue is urban, and the orange on top of each are the households with air conditioners. Only 5% of the households in India currently have an AC. By about 2040, about half the households might have one. As the economy improves, the temperatures rise, and we build more urban areas, making it even hotter, we will see more ACs. Now, the heat rejected from these ACs will in turn make the outside air even hotter. You know how air conditioners work. They cool the inside air and they reject heat outside. So your outside air will get even hotter, which will then require you to use your AC even more. So it's a vicious cycle. Once the outside air is above the comfort temperature, every degree centigrade in the average daily temperature drives an increase in electricity demand. With the current low ownership of ACs in India, a 1 degree centigrade temperature increase currently drives about a 2% rise in electricity demand on the grid, electricity demand during hot periods. So if everyone had an AC, it would be 20 times that 2%, or a nearly 80% increase in electricity demand. Because of this combination of hot weather, population, and economy, energy consumption in buildings in India is expected to increase faster than in any other global regions. After a small setback during the pandemic, the rate has picked up again. India ranks amongst the leading electricity producing countries worldwide, just below China and the United States. This is a chart of electricity production in India from 2012 to 2021. Sorry, 2022. So in 2022, India generated close to 20% of this electricity from renewable resources. So these are showing you all the resources that are being used: biomass, wind, solar, hydro, nuclear. And then below that, you have energy from fossil fuels. And you can see that most of India's electricity, 3/4, is still generated from coal. So the electricity generated in India has a high carbon footprint. Look at this important statistic. In 2021, building emissions accounted for around a fifth of India's total carbon emissions and 33%, a third of the total energy use, went to buildings. So the carbon intensity of India's electricity grid is currently about 0.7 kgs of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. That is nearly twice that of other G20 countries because of our fuel mix. That means every 3 kilowatt hours of electricity used in India produces about 2 kilograms of carbon emissions. An average air conditioner, let's say you have a 1500-watt air conditioner, it will use about 1.5 kilowatt hours in 1 hour and about 500 kilowatt hours in 1 month. So in 3 months of summer, it would use about 1500 kilowatt hours. 1500 kilowatt hours used for one AC in one summer will produce about 1000 kilograms of carbon emissions. That's 1 ton of carbon dioxide from one AC in one season. And you know, once carbon is produced, it goes into the air and it stays there for hundreds of years. Carbon dioxide has a life of hundreds of years. So one AC is producing 1 ton of carbon. Now multiply that by 100 million air conditioners in an urban India and imagine what that will do. But you know what? The high use of carbon-heavy electricity is only part of the problem. The refrigerants used in ACs are also a huge source of global warming and climate change. This is a graphic I created for my Decarbonizing Buildings course, which is offered at the George Washington University in DC. You will also see this graphic if you take the DFGE course, which is Designing for Greater Efficiency, offered by IFC, which is the World Bank. It's free. Yep, free. And we are working on a new version, which will be coming out in a few weeks. So I highly recommend you check it out. And I highly recommend designers to take that course to change the course on how we design. Again, it's called Designing for Greater Efficiency. Please check it out. Anyway, in this graphic, you see the global warming potential or GWP value of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. That's that little black dot in the center. This is actually used as the unit of global warming potential measurement or GWP measurement because carbon dioxide is the most common gas in the atmosphere. And its value is set as 1. So 1 ton of carbon dioxide GWP value is 1. Now, the Freon in air conditioners has a refrigerant called R410A, okay, which has a GWP of 2000 per ton. So if CO2 is 1, 410A is 2000. That is roughly 2000 GWP per 900 kilograms of refrigerant gas. So 1 ton of gas is about 900 kilograms. And R410A is the biggest gray box that you see on the screen. So you can compare its impact to that of carbon dioxide. In fact, most common refrigerants used today, which are made of HFC and HCFC, that is hydrofluorocarbons and hydrochlorofluorocarbons. So anytime you hear the word chloro or fluoro, it's a bad thing. They are more than 1,000 times potent than carbon dioxide in terms of GWP or global warming potential. To get a sense of scale, what does this mean in the real world? Every 1 ton air conditioner requires about 1 to 2 kg of refrigerant. So 900 kg or 1 ton of R410A represents about 500 to 1,000 air conditioners, depending on their size. When this refrigerant gas leaks, eventually, it either leaks or if it is not disposed of properly, it escapes into the atmosphere, causing 2,000 units of global warming. Now imagine the impact of that for 100 million air conditioners. This is actually what I've done in this figure, calculated that impact. So these are some calculations I did way back in 2017 for a paper I was writing on coolants for my clients at the World Bank. So the orange parts here are direct emissions from refrigerants. And the blue parts are the indirect emissions from the electricity used for air conditioning, because the emissions are not at the building, they're at the power plant. So they're called indirect. As you can see, in a business as usual scenario, which we call the BAU, business as usual scenario, the total emissions from air conditioning for India alone by 2030 could be almost as much as the rest of the global emissions that we had from air conditioners in 2010. These AC emission numbers are approaching 5% of the current total global emissions. Because by 2050, the emissions from air conditioning in India could be more than double the global emissions that we had from AC in 2010. That's about 5% of the total global emissions. You see, in 2013, we had very few air conditioners. And in 2050, if we keep doing what we're doing today, this is how much the impact would be. Even though China has an equivalent population, and their population is even more urban than India's, China does not have the same temperature profile. It is much more north, much cooler. India, with its combination of rising incomes, rising population, and India's temperature profile, is the most significant country globally for producing and also for reducing emissions from cooling. The best part is that this number could also be cut in half by designers like yourselves using currently available technology. India is rapidly getting richer, but an increase in GDP does not have to mean an increase in air conditioning and an increase in energy use. High energy use is not a badge of honor. In fact, as we can see in this figure, most advanced economies have decoupled their energy use and their GDP. So this is showing you data from advanced countries. Their GDP is on the rise, but their energy use per unit of GDP is getting lower and lower from 1990 to 2015. The lowest line here is the energy use per unit of GDP. Using resources more efficiently is in any country's national interest. According to the Energy Outlook for India, and this has actually been produced by the US International Energy Agency, which studies other countries as well. This is their analysis for India. So India was on this track before the pandemic. It had a little dip in 2020, and now it's on this track in the current policy scenario. However, there is a sustainable development scenario, and you can see that the growth, I should mention that the x-axis here in this chart, the x-axis is the years, and the y-axis is the electricity demand. So in a sustainable development scenario, the electricity demand would be about half, increased only about half compared to business as usual. In a country like India that is growing so rapidly, the impact of construction and climate is also a key consideration. So we talked about the use of energy in buildings, we talked about the use of refrigerants in buildings, but also there is the emissions from construction. Right up front in a building life cycle, there are large amounts of emissions associated with building materials. Cement, steel, aluminum, and glass are the largest contributors to emissions from building materials globally. This is true globally. So a responsible architect can make a huge impact in this area by thinking about alternate materials and alternate ways to save materials. So to wrap up this second section on impacts, let me just say that carbon emissions move freely across political boundaries. This view of global carbon emissions by NASA, so it's like, you're zooming out, looking at the whole world, and it helps us appreciate that we have to think about these emissions from a global point of view and not through political boundaries. The emissions we are creating in India are going to warm up the entire world. So, coming to part 3 of the presentation, how can architects harness this large opportunity? By designing in such a way that provides financial stability, environmental stability, and good health and thermal comfort for their clients. I will briefly share 10 guideposts here. Number 1, own your impact. First of all, architects must understand and own the tremendous amount of impact they can have. As the famous environmentalist Jane Goodall has said, that what you do makes a difference. And you have to decide what type of difference you want to make. I promise that I talk in numbers, so here are some more numbers and lots of them. But you don't have to try and read them. These are the results of energy modeling simulations for an apartment building in Washington, D.C. And the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that in this apartment project, we found that improved air tightness would save more than 15% energy. Adding insulation would save about 11%, and high performance windows would save about 3%. Some lights that were still not LEDs, imagine in this day and age not having LEDs. So changing out those few lights would add another 0.5% savings. And then using occupancy sensors would save another 1%. all those measures that do not involve a mechanical engineer yet already bring us 30% savings. Solar photovoltaics generated another 6%. And when we combined heat pumps instead of conventional air conditioners with the other envelope and other measures, we got a total of 66% savings. That is, we could bring down the energy use by 2/3. Again, hard to read slide, and I'll just share our findings verbally, but this is a very large biopharmaceutical company in it's actually a UK company based with a headquarters in Maryland in the US. This is a building where we found that reducing the air leakage in this large healthcare building yielded about 21% savings. Adding insulation to this airtight envelope yielded another 3% for a total of 24% savings just from tightening the envelope. So this building is from the 1980s. It's an old building. Additional insulation did not yield any savings. So this is also why energy modeling is important. It tells you when something is not effective and you shouldn't waste your money on it. So roof insulation yielded about 5% savings. It's a low building. If you have a very tall building, roof insulation is not going to make much difference because a very small area covered by it. So combining all these again got us to 30% savings. Adding window film only got about 3% improvement, but upgrading the old metal windows, which also upgrades the frame, got us 17% improvement. So when combined, the air tightness, roof and wall insulation, and window upgrades got us 46% in savings. We are cutting our energy use by almost half. So we then tried to push the envelope further, literally speaking. Even better windows, U value of 0.15 instead of 0.2, got us another 2%. But the biggest thing is reducing the window area to 50% from 70% got us another 8% in savings. Now, the sunshades. We also analyzed the potential for shading, which is very uncommon in commercial buildings in urban areas. So here there was a surprise in store. Look at the building footprint. It's a Y-shaped building and the sun path diagram. So given this shape of the building, we naturally expected to see savings by shading the south side. That's the direction the sun goes. So to my surprise, we also saw significant savings by shading the east and the west walls because they are fairly exposed to the sun. This is also what I love about energy modeling. Even if you've been doing it for 20 years, a model can sometimes beat your intuition. So you'll see two depths of shades drawn here. The solar path diagram indicated, so this is a solar path diagram, and it indicated an ideal depth of 7-foot shades. But when we looked at the price of those shades, we found that 3.5-foot shades, that's about 1 meter deep shades, were much more economical. So we modeled those. We looked at the comparison and we found that it only made a difference of 1%. So that's what we recommended. So, by the way, I do want to give a shout out to my partner in crime here, Maz Dikshit of Seed Consulting. She's based in Gujarat, and I work very closely with her on these modeling projects that I've shared. Okay, so the next, number 2, get started. What do I mean by that? We don't need the perfect team or the perfect solution. Like we saw earlier, every kilowatt hour saved makes a difference to our planet. So if you can start with just one thing that you can improve in a project, do that. Make it standard practice in your projects. You can keep exploring and adding more ideas in the next project. I want to stress that we shouldn't lose any opportunity that we have, because once built, the performance of our buildings gets locked in for the life of the building for the next 50 to 100 years. So we must act whenever we get a chance to make things better. This graphic that we created at Energy Shrink shows the history of energy efficiency in the US. I'll let you take a look at it while I take a quick water break. All right. So the US happens to be the most advanced market for energy efficiency initiatives. Now, before 1973, energy consumption was booming in the US. Nobody cared because electricity was cheap. But the oil crisis in the 70s changed attitudes. People wanted to be energy independent from oil nations. It took another 20 years to create green building rating systems. And now, finally, another 30 years later, we are looking at mass scale efficiency. Before that, it was just individual green buildings here and there. So it takes time to get there. The US took 50 years, but we are in a climate crisis. So hopefully, with access to all the knowledge in the world, India can leapfrog many of these stages and get right to it. I know that India is still working on implementing building codes, building energy codes. But I'd like you to keep in mind that building energy codes set the minimum acceptable standard of performance. Meeting code is like getting a passing mark. It's like getting a D. Indians like to get A's. Don't settle for a D. Get to learn your energy codes and then do much, much better than the minimum. Get an A. So one constructive way to think about doing better with our buildings is to get used to performing life cycle analysis to quantify the emissions from a building over its lifespan. So this graphic shows building emissions over a 30-year span. The blue bars show operational emissions, and the operational emissions, that is emissions from the running the building, from the operations of the building, they stem primarily from power production. The light blue bars here indicate a conventional building. The dark blue bars indicate a high performance building that is efficient, using less energy. So it has lower operational emissions every year. The source of the energy matters too. A coal power plant produces high emissions, but a wind energy source or a hydroelectric power plant produces much lower emissions. So as we clean up our electricity grid, our building's operations emissions will reduce. This is what the downward slope of the blue bars indicates. Embodied emissions are shown in orange. Embodied carbon emissions stem primarily from construction materials. So the initial building construction phase, right, when you're just starting to build the building, is the primary source of embodied emissions. We also see additional embodied emissions during like repair and maintenance, and then at the end of the useful life of the building when you're demolishing it. But together, these contribute to the life cycle emissions from buildings. Note that the initial construction emissions are the highest compared to the steady but long-term operational emissions. I mean, these will also, if you add them up, will climb even higher than operational. I mean, they're embodied, but it takes time to get there. So if you can impact your construction emissions, you can have the largest impact in the short term. We need to be looking for solutions immediately because of the climate crisis. All right, number 3, know the value of sustainability. Sustainability is not just a nice to have feature for greenies. It has real financial impacts for owners, especially if we can save energy in a country like India, where energy is quite expensive. So one example of financial impact is that green buildings command premium rents. Green buildings also sell faster than average. For example, this is an example from the US. Brookfield Real Estate in the US built 11 net zero homes in New York in 2021. For those 11 homes, about 1,400 people expressed interest in the first few days. So even though these homes are priced at about 10% more than their neighboring homes, these homes went really fast. So the developer then planned to build 200 more homes like that. All right, next, number 4, consider the climate. Now, this is at the heart of everything that an architect can do right. Consider the climate. From a building physics perspective, the fundamentals of how a building behaves don't change from one building site to another. When we model these in any software program, the same principles of physics apply in any simulation software. Some applications may be better at calculating heat transfer by the minute, and other software may be better for natural ventilation, but essentially the same fundamental principles of physics are being modeled. The heat transfer, natural ventilation, etc. So in modeling, we use the term GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. So yeah, you can have bad models, which are totally useless if they're not done well. But for a reasonably good model, a typical process looks like this. An architect provides building design information, and then this is combined with climate data in a simulation calculator, churned through the simulation engine using a bunch of physics equations to produce outputs. The outputs may be energy or water use, daylighting patterns, ventilation patterns. But the key in all these is the location. So you see, your design may be the same. This physics doesn't change. The outputs don't change. It's the climate data. The location, the climate of that location determines how the same building will perform in Kullu versus Kerala. That is why good passive design is also called climate responsive design. So get to know your climate zones, learn their temperature, rainfall patterns, wind directions, angles of the sun in winter and summer. Take the time to understand what design elements work best in those climates. And I can guarantee you one thing, in no climate zone in India do glass towers make sense. In fact, glass towers don't make sense in most climate zones in the world. Maybe in Hawaii, and if you have all the windows open, you could do that. But that is because glass buildings act like greenhouses, and we are not plants. So that's the last thing we need in a hot climate. I invite you to search up my article in a magazine called Triple Pundit. It's online. The article is called Shattering Glass Myths. To understand why I'm saying this better, I've written more than one article on this topic, and it's one of my pet peeves. So before I start getting upset, I'll move on to the next point. But please do look it up. Shattering Glass Myths. All right, number 5. Aspire for thermal comfort, not air conditioning. We talked about air conditioning and energy. It's worth noting that our goal is to achieve thermal comfort. Thermal comfort is achieved simply by being mindful of the natural elements and sheltering ourselves from the extremes. Most of our energy use for cooling and heating goes into maintaining the temperature and humidity of that ball of air that we are living in. This is why airtight envelopes make sense in a very hot and dry or a very cold climate. They don't make sense in Kerala, where natural ventilation is the key to comfort for many months in the year. But if it's too hot, another way to keep comfortable in Kerala is to seal your house really well and then use a dehumidifier to reduce the humidity with controlled mechanical ventilation for fresh air. You do need fresh air if you seal a building very well. So anytime we introduce a mechanical system like an air conditioner, we designers want to detail our seals and our air tightness as best as possible. Did you know that air can pass through cement, brick, and gypsum board? If you want to make a building airtight, you have to use special layers on the wall and roof and floor materials with something called low permeability. It's measured in perms, how much it allows the air to pass through. So these are typically special paints and membranes like paper and plastic barriers called air barriers. And then we install these, and then we want to make sure that it's continuous. It's a continuously air sealed space with no breaks, and it gets adequate fresh air from a controlled mechanical ventilation system. All right, number 6, keep it simple. There are a lot of fancy technologies available these days. BMS systems, artificial intelligence systems, automated motorized blinds, and other smart systems. But I'd like to propose that we keep it dumb. Dumb is good. Dumb doesn't break easily, and it doesn't need a highly trained specialist to fix it if it doesn't work. In case you missed this news, recently we had a situation in a school in Massachusetts which could not switch off its lights for a whole year because their very expensive smart lighting control system malfunctioned and they couldn't find a part for it. They couldn't figure out how to fix it, so the lights were just on the whole year. In contrast, measures like insulation are dumb. Good quality windows are dumb. Doors that fit in the frames properly and seal a room are dumb. And if you build them right the first time, they last forever. So an example of this approach is again air sealing. An architect would want to focus on ensuring that they can preserve that conditioned ball of air that we saw earlier. That is what passive house techniques are all about, ensuring an unbroken envelope air seal. Designing iconic Jenga block shapes might, make us into famous architects, but they can be really uncomfortable for people living inside these spaces. And they can be hard to insulate and make sure that they're waterproof. So let me just say again, no, don't do this. All right, number 7, focus on the fundamentals. Reviewing the fundamental natural climate elements in the early design stage is the key to good design. The key climate elements are the sun, wind, and humidity. They impact temperature, daylighting, ventilation, infiltration, humidity, and moisture damage in the building. Some strategies that we can use to manage these impacts include building orientation, window wall ratio, thermal mass, insulation, thermal bridging, rain screens. So many things an architect can do. And an architect must look at these elements. A mechanical electrical engineer is not even going to consider them. All right, number 8, build it to last. To reduce emissions from materials in the future, we must build good quality buildings that can hold up to harsh elements like floods and strong winds so that we don't have to keep rebuilding. This ability of a building to withstand stress, whether it is chronic stress like regular heavy rains or sudden shocks like a flood, it's called its resilience. Resilience can be measured and evaluated. For example, this tool on the screen is a free tool, again, free, developed by my colleagues at the World Bank. It's called the Building Resilience Index. It's available online. It has a few metrics you can enter to see what the risks are for your building in your location, and then plan on how to reduce those risks to make your building resilient. Okay, number 9. Truly sustainable buildings are those that will sustain themselves over the years. And that will also help sustain human life during their lifetime. To achieve such measurable energy, carbon, and resilience goals, architects must engage with the broader team and follow what we call an integrated design process. Big slide here. I'll keep it quick. The process of integrated design is a disruptive approach to design. In the traditional approach, which is on the first half of the slide, energy is not considered in the early design stage, which is in the orange color. Energy modeling is done by mechanical electrical engineers in the DD and CD phase. the design development, construction development stage. And at the bid stage, many times efficiency options get value engineered out of the project. Compare that to the approach in the bottom half of the slide. This is the integrated design approach. For lead projects that claim the integrated design credit, architects and the rest of the team sign a letter saying that they have an integrated team. But what does it really mean? In this process, architects engage with other trades, like the energy modeler, like the mechanical engineer, from the outset. From the time they look at a site, they talk to these guys and they evaluate the quantitative impact their decisions are going to have on the energy use of the building. Which way do you orient it? How big do you make it? How much mass do you put into your walls? You talk to an energy modeler about these things from the beginning. Only an architect will understand and manage this part. And if they don't, by the time you get to the green part of the process, it is too late to bake in these key green design aspects. Remember that these aspects get locked in for the life of the building. And if we don't lock them in, it is not possible to retrofit, to fix the building for some of these elements at all, and others without significant investment of cost and time. But this is not the traditional business model. The fees of an architect typically doesn't include budget for energy modeling. So how can we get there? We need a new business model. We need to educate our client about the value of doing this upfront to save them money later. But bottom line is we have to engage early in the design process in these decisions. And so the combined hard and soft costs of a project can be kept under control. In fact, if you do it right, you can even save the client money at the end of the project. And finally, the last point, learn from history. Isn't this the point of Anveshan, this conference? To learn from history to inform the future. We can actually save our clients money by looking at how we did things before we decided to build glass box buildings in Bangalore and then throw a whole bunch of energy and air conditioning at them to solve the problem. Machiavelli famously said that whoever wishes to foresee the future must consult the past. So one final historical fact I would like you to consider is that central air conditioning is less than 100 years old. Meanwhile, passive design principles have been around for centuries. People in Rajasthan, Assam, Himachal, Kerala all had unique building styles to suit their climates. Well, we cannot go back to those times. We no longer have those materials, that labor, those skills anymore. But we can learn the underlying fundamental ideas. For example, high ceilings with openings and lightweight walls are good in Kerala climate. Laurie Baker had the right idea about this. But thick insulated walls are good in Himachal and Delhi. So if we can consider these elements, our client could save money on installing many extra tons of air conditioning and then also on those steep monthly bills, which will keep getting higher every year with global warming because you'll have to use your AC more. So how do we achieve these design ideas with today's materials and labor and machinery within the client's budget? That is the challenge the architects need to solve today. There are several beautiful examples you can see from Washington in the west to Austria to the Philippines in the east. And please, before I go, don't build glass boxes in India. The future of our habitat, our earth, our home is in our hands. So here are some additional resources if anybody would like to follow up. You can check out these courses and certifications. And finally, a couple of notes about Energy Shrink. Energy Shrink is based in the Washington, D.C. area. We work with innovative clients on decarbonizing buildings. And we provide analytics such as energy modeling, green building policy advisory, and research services. We also provide large-scale energy program implementation services. With that, thank you very much. Here's my contact information, and I will take questions. Thank you.